Good day, everyone. Today we have our third installment of one of the most exciting series I've had on the channel. And please join me in welcoming the magnificent Jonathan. How are you, Jonathan?
Wow, that's high praise indeed. I'm very well, thank you, Hanney. How are you in on this wonderful Saturday?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm really enjoying this conversation. It's one of my favorite because it's flowing quite nicely, and I like the way um, it just follows the narrative from the very beginning, and it shows hold and provides sort of arguments as the story of God sort of flows from the very beginning all the way. You're gonna, I guess, take it to the very end. So I do like the narrative of it, to be honest, so far.
It's interesting when you get I've done many talks to different sort of humanists and atheist organizations and skeptics in the pub and all these movements in the UK, and you go and give talks, and some organizations are sort of in a position where they say, yeah, we're kind of over the whether God exists or not kind of conversation now. We're past that, and we like to talk about other things. And you say, okay, fair enough, but I get booked in anyway. And then they are the talks always where people are the most like involved. Everyone loves a good whether God exists or not. And these kind of like general ideas of God, omni-God that we've been talking about, it just floats people's boats. And I don't think people do get past that, because even if you are in a position where, as many of your viewers might be, where you're like, yeah, I don't believe in God, I'm over that, you still love to argue about it. There's still something about it that's just got that universal appeal.
I don't know if you recall the conversation between the four horsemen of the apocalypse, like Hitchens, Sam Harris, Dennett, and who else was there? Dawkins. Remember, Hitchens was sipping on his whiskey, and I think he kind of surprised everyone when they said, "Oh, won't we all want to see the back end of religion?" And Christopher Hitchens said, "No." So why not? He said, well, there'll be nothing to argue about. He actually enjoys the argument.
Yeah, this is it. And so when I have these moments when I'm questioning why I do what I do, but in terms of writing, YouTube, all this kind of stuff, I do wonder how much is about finding out new things for me, how much is about, getting towards a greater, more accurate understanding of reality for me, how much is about helping other people, how much is about is earning an income. But actually, in reality, most of it is about because I really enjoy it. Do you know what I mean? Like if I didn't enjoy it so much, I wouldn't do it. So the largest component of why I do these things is because, damn it, I enjoy it. There you go.
Do you think, Jonathan, because I've been thinking about it for quite some time, and I think I got to the bottom of it. Do you think probing the question of God's existence for atheists like us, it's more to do with we're actually probing the psychology of humanity? When you reflect on the story of God, we're really reflecting on the story of humanity, our insecurities, our lack of knowledge, when we're scared because we don't understand how things working. Do you think this is interesting?
100%. Yeah, 100%. But maybe in a more, I don't know if it's just a truism. It's just a reflection of who we are at any point of where we are. Who we are when we are. So, the kind of God that we believed in 3,000 years ago was a God that reflected what we knew at the time and what we didn't know at the time, and what we sought to explain by invoking God to explain these things. And then, the kind of God that we're arguing about now is this one that's been abstracted out of all of that. And it's like much more philosophical. And actually, we've got to a point in society. So this is where you look at ideas of correlations and causations for belief around the world, right? So you say, okay, the Nordic states, Norway, Sweden, etc., have the lowest belief in the world. Why is that? They also have the highest existential security. So there's less crime, there's greater healthcare, well-being. They've got a robust tax system that provides security for its inhabitants. In other words, people literally feel secure on a day-to-day basis. If they lose their job, then they will still be secure, right? And so therefore, they don't need God. When you look at the places where war-torn societies have the greater violence, has a greater belief and religiosity, and so what we believe is a reflection of where we are at in our lives and in the history of humanity and in societies.
Yeah. So if we made God in our own image, doesn't it then follow that blunt, in your face, straightforward, black and white God is almost the reflection of humanity? When he used to think that way, if they catch a killer, then they're just going to get killed. That's it. That's the end of the story. There is no nuances about it. But as we are abstracting our own behavior. Like, oh, we caught him killing somebody, but hold on a second. Do not just start the fire just yet. Can we find out why did he do it, and what drove him? So, and God has become almost abstract the way we're starting to abstract ourselves.
This is all really interesting because you start getting onto the whole free will determinism debate. But the idea is, if we start properly understanding human behavior, then we start understanding why people do things. And then the world is just a really nuanced and complex place. And the certainty of God in this kind of black and white understanding of reality isn't sometimes just doesn't do the trick, especially when you've got the old school ideas of heaven and hell. And you're like, well, actually, heaven and hell is some digital appraisal of humanity. It isn't good enough, because there's all sorts of behaviors going on, a whole spectrum of behaviors. And these are largely, arguments I deal with in the book, 30 Arguments Against the Existence of God, is this idea that heaven and hell notion just is broken for modern society. It doesn't really work. But yeah, I think the thing is, humans love certainty, and with certainty you get God. And I think we talked about a little bit last time about how I talked about it on one of my own interviews, about how sometimes we like people to do the thinking for us. So in a free thought community, in the atheistic community, we sing the praises of people who think freely for themselves, right? As if that is the great thing. And it is, like, objectively, not objectively, but it seems to be a pretty great characteristic to have, to be able to think for yourself and to be, free thinking in that respect. However, there's an awful lot of society who like to be thought for, who like to go to church and have their pastor do their thinking for them and deliver what their opinions are, and then they go out and take those opinions on and take them out into the world. It's like, and because I think it plays into certainty. If some person with like this sense of certainty is telling you things, then actually I don't have to expend much energy just taking that on, and then I'm going to go and use that out in the world. And I think,
Jonathan, I think this is going to persist, because I think this is an evolutionary situation. We cannot all be silverbacks or leaders. We've evolved to have certain amount of leaders, because if everybody's going to be a leader, the amount of energy that's going to be extended is going to be huge. So you're going to rely on certain numbers of the groups to lead, and you need your soldier bees to do the actually daily work. Just like any other animal. So I think I can understand why.
It's like economics. You're going to need people to do your manual labor. You're going to need people to do your white collar management jobs, and you're going to need your sociopaths to be your CEOs and all this kind of stuff. But thank you so much, idiosyncrasy. And to talk about evolutionary pressures, we can consider, why is it that we are so good at just listening to what our elders or authority figures tell us? There were things like the Stanley Milgram experiments that taught, that showed that if someone in a white coat tells you to do something that's pretty heinous, you end up doing it anyway, because authority figures, and that kind of went towards explaining how Nazi Germany took place, blah, 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 blah. But from an evolutionary point of view, if an elder says don't eat that red berry, it's going to poison you because that's been passed down, it's been learnt at some point, then it's in your best interest to believe them, because the only other way of finding out the truth of that is to do it yourself, which could well lead to you dying. Right? It's almost like a Pascal's wager type thing. So you say, okay, I'm going to believe you because that's a shortcut to what I think is probably true, and it's a lot safer for me to do that, and I'm more likely to survive, and so therefore evolution will select that in. So we do believe our elders. And there is, in order for us to sit there and disagree with the pastor, we kind of have to put a lot of effort of rationality in, and kind of fight against some of our evolutionary pressures to become the free thinkers that we think are the good.
Especially when you add to that the other very strong element of hyperactive agency detection. Like we are the offspring of those who, when they heard the rustling in the trees, they ran away, even though it might just be wind. And if they were overly critical, sitting around pondering what's the reason, they might have been, so we understand, and it persists by the looks of things to date.
Yeah. Yes. So, and this kind of, in a sense, moves us on to the section of the book that we've got to, which is the part 2 of the book, why we believe or not. And I start off the section before I get onto the arguments with a bit of preamble about, well, there are things, you've got, and we've talked about this a little bit before in previous videos, which is like, what's a function of religion, right? Well, what does religion do for people? Because we need to understand that. Because God exists as a function, right? And if we're going to disabuse people of the God belief, then we need to understand what the belief does for them, and quite possibly replace those things with secular stuff. So if you are getting your social networking from your church organization, from your so on and so forth, and you get ostracized if you're kicked out of there, then actually that's understanding that the function of religion for you might not be in the content of the religious holy books, but it's going to be in what you're getting as far as your social and psychological hits, and how can we provide that on the secular stage. And likewise, if you're getting explanation, so if God explains all these things for you, well, actually, we can. That's somewhere where the secular world really can do a pretty good job of explaining things an awful lot better. What we might come a cropper with is something like explaining how the universe started, or explaining how consciousness exists, right? And what religious people do is they do the God of the gaps, God did it, whatever. It's like, I've got certainty. God created the universe, even though it doesn't stand up to scientific scrutiny. It's that certainty, it's that attribution of explanation that religion is really good at. So for the non-religious people, we've got to provide really good, better explanations, which they are more accurate, but sometimes they're more complicated. And that's a real challenge, rather than, God created the universe, job done. So on and so forth. And then, so there are these other things that also exist to keep believers in. And I mentioned this previously. So heaven and hell are your big ones. They are the biggest carrot and stick in human conceptions. There's nothing greater and nothing worse than heaven and hell. And these are what I call mimetic fail-safes that keep you, trapped into this memeplex, this kind of set of religious ideas, right? You're trapped in there because if you leave, you might go to hell, and if you stay in, you're going to go to heaven.
Yeah.
And
Jonathan, I'm very sorry to interrupt, but I just remember something here that is actually, it's done on business model, and I think you might relate here. I do supply chain and freight forwarding, and I believe selling religion is like selling any service or product. If you sell religion, and it's just the belief of God, in God, that's you moving the freight for somebody. But if you start adding extra bits and pieces of services, and we call it brick walling, which means the cost for this customer to exit the partnership with that particular service provider is way too expensive. So if you start doing warehousing, So you move their freight, but you do the warehousing, and then you give them some technology where they can start tracking their shipment, and they become so dependent on the service that the cost to exit is very, very expensive. And we call that brick walling in marketing and business. And I think religion does just that.
That's perfect. Do you know what you've made me think? Like we talked in the green room beforehand about how I spend too much time doing output, writing and videos and stuff. You've just given me yet another stimulus for writing an article. So you're going to have to remind me of that, because that's a great analogy, and I love analogies because they're so powerful. But yeah, I think that's absolutely perfect. So what you'll do is you're just, the cost of the barrier of entry to non-religion is just too high, and and the brick wall that keeps you in place in religion is just too difficult to navigate and too expensive, either expensive in literal terms or expensive in cognitive conceptual terms, so yeah.
Obviously the segue here as well, your book is not referring to a god. It's not 30 arguments against the existence of a god. You say god, and you mean a certain god, and we've defined it in the previous two parts. But then you're in this part two of your book, you're going to zone on the religion, because God alone, left to fend for himself, is I think is way too weak. The norms and the mores and the customs, the Christmas, your Ramadan, your Eid, the ceremonies, the things, the rituals, because we're quite ritualistic animals, aren't we? Like, we are used to, we need certain things to do to group together under the same name.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's been heaps of psychological research into the place the rituals have, and there are several different models of why, or theories as to why rituals are functionally beneficial or what they provide. But yeah, all those things, you add them all together, and it's that brick walling that you were talking about. So there you go. So what does Ray have to say? I was thinking the same thing: a place to find your mate, a place to care for your children, take care of the social needs of the elderly. Yeah, the provision. I mean, it's so powerful, and what that means is that we can, on the one hand, write books that clearly show that God doesn't exist, but that's useless if you're not providing childcare and looking after the elderly of the believers. So. It's like, oh, I might as well still believe this because it's quite simple. I get it. It's kind of indoctrinated. It gives me all the easy answers. I don't need to think very much. And you know what? My entire life is taken care of within this framework. I mean, then you go to places like Afghanistan, right? And that brick walling is, you've got a gargantuan wall to try and climb, because if you want to be an outspoken atheist in Afghanistan, you will end up dying. And so therefore it just ain't going to happen. And these are the mimetic fail safes that religions put in place to keep their believers in tow, and it's just a real challenge.
But
So
and it works on the nature of the people you're referring. So if there might be a person who would prefer to have that kind of worldview. Some people are just so comforted by this. It's like, why do I want to go into the misery of having to all these doubts and not being sure? I've got some comfortable life here with all questions are answered for me.
that's exactly what I was saying earlier. So it's, it's that certainty, and I want people to think for me. I don't want to have to go out. If I've got a really hard job where I'm on the breadline and I'm working crazy all day, I don't have the mental space to consider whether or not God exists. I'm just doing my stuff, and then once in a while I get to do some religious ritual, and everyone else that are around me all believe the same thing, and there's this kind of social conformity. Job done. It's easy, but to go against that requires an awful lot of sometimes great pain and suffering, and even death. Yeah. So the arguments after that, I mean, in that section, I talk a little bit about Pascal's wager and how that's not a very good approach, and it's broken because it kind of it implies one religion. So you might as well believe in God. Yeah, but which God? Like, because if I believe in the wrong God, I'm still going to go to hell, you know? So
And you know what? He was a mathematician, and I think he's got the math all wrong.
yeah, it's just a really bad argument. But what it tells you actually is that in his world at the time, you only had the digital scenario of Christianity or non-religion, you know, or kind of like maybe some kind of agnosticism or deism or whatever. You know, there weren't this plurality of religions because actually that wasn't, you know, in his landscape really. But yeah, so the first argument I'll talk about is not so much about the psychology now. So a lot of these arguments are going to be about how unfair God is. So if God is all loving, this omni God we've been talking about, if God is all loving, you would expect that everything that God does should be fair. And by fair, I mean there should be an equality of opportunity to access God's love, which means that if you're going to have 50 people born, you would think if you're fair, all those 50 people are going to have equal opportunity to access the correct God and the correct God's love. Because if you created a scenario where some of those aren't, and then if you're introducing things like punishment of hell and whatever, then actually you look morally repugnant. But the problem is, when you look at the world, it is clearly a case of an inequality of opportunity of access to God's love or even knowledge of God at all. And just as a warning, you can't really use it's okay, it'll all be sorted out in heaven. I don't know if I said this in a previous video, but you quite often hear that, and you hear this, say a 6-month-old baby's died. You go, oh, that 6-month-old baby has died of cancer. That's terrible. And the religious person will say, oh, it's okay. They've gone to heaven where they live for eternity. And you're like, that is compensation. It is not moral justification. So I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but Hanney, if I walked up to you in the street and I punched you in the jaw and broke your jaw, right, for no particular reason, no reason that anyone could see, just like horrible thing to do, right? That is morally horrible thing to do. And then I paid you $10,000, right, and said, sorry about that. I'm compensating for you for what I did. What that $10,000 doesn't do, well, it depends, but what it generally doesn't do for the theist is make that action of punching you in the face and breaking your jaw morally good. It isn't suddenly a good thing to have done because I've compensated you precisely because it was bad, right? So, but the only way that my giving you money makes it a good moral action is if you use a really strict form of consequentialism. And there are lots of different types of consequentialism, but this would be a form that's like, we're only going to look at the particular outcomes after a certain amount of time to this action. And the outcome was you got a broken jaw, but you also got $10,000 and you were happy with that. And so therefore you were like, yeah, actually it's morally good. I don't mind. That's a good thing. Now, if you had that particular brand of consequentialism, and that might be all right, but no theist generally does. William Lane Craig talks about consequentialism being a terrible ethic. You don't need God for that moral value system. So it ain't a good moral value system for theists. So therefore, when they say it all gets balanced in heaven, it is fine. They are not actually doing what they think they're doing. They are providing a compensation and not a moral justification. Does that make sense?
Yes. I've always thought that this sort of argument really sort of fails miserably. I mean, that's the ultimate consequentialism there when you apply it that way. Anyway, I remember Christopher Hitchens was talking about was it Frau Frist, the lady who was kept in a dungeon by her dad and was raped for 25 years. And it was deemed as like, right, God is going to make that all right later on. Like, what?
Yeah.
Why did you have to go through that in the first place?
And what you're doing, so normally, like you would want to try and make that consequences pretty much near where you're doing it, rather than like in a different dimension and not at the same time. Like do you know what I mean? This also breaks what's called the Pauline principle. The Pauline principle is from Romans 3:8. So if you're a Christian, Romans 3:8 basically says you shouldn't. I'm paraphrasing. It says he basically condemns the person that Paul does something evil to get a good end, right? Which is consequentialism. So Romans 3:8 is an area in the Bible which is very clear on that. Now it's whether you say that applies to all scenarios or not, but you know, we have an example of in the Bible where that kind of moral evaluation is bad, as according to Paul.
But it's kind of more Machiavelli. Like I'm sensing more of a Machiavelli pragmatism here of the end justifies the mean.
Yeah, which is classic utilitarianism. You know, it's like if you walk into a hospital, it's okay. We can cut you up into 5 different pieces and provide those 5 pieces to 5 people who are dying. That's great. We've actually, this is like the trolley experiment. We've actually made 5 people survive. But you're thinking, hang on, I didn't consent to this. And so there's so I'm going to throw this out here because I've just written an article on this on Only Sky about God and informed consent. So the title was something like God's not very good at informed consent, which sounds a bit like did he ask Mary for permission before impregnating her? No, I'm not talking about that, although I could. But the idea of informed consent is if you are going to use people for a means to an end, then it's usually polite that you ask them and get there and inform them of that. So think about a doctor's procedure, a surgery or an injection, right? You say, right, this is going to hurt and these are the side effects, okay? So these are the negatives, but these are the positives. You're going to live another 20 years or whatever. So what do you want to decide, Hanney? And you go, right, thank you. You've informed me of all these options, right? And I'm going to go, yes, I'm going to have that surgery. Or, yes, I'm going to have that injection. Brilliant. I've informed you. You've got your consent. We're going to go through that. And then we have consequentialism. But it's being dictated by your informed consent. But when religious people use theodicies, right? When they are using like 230,000 people dying in a tsunami and all those animals, and then people saying, oh, there could be a reason, right? Skeptical theism, or it's because of soul building or free will or whatever, even though that they don't work particularly for that example. The problem is even if you're positing some kind of, even if you're just saying, I don't know what the reason is, there is a reason. The problem is God hasn't asked those people whether he can kill them all for this greater reason. Do you know what I mean? Like 230,000 people had just been killed in a tsunami, and none of them said to God, I don't mind if you kill me for someone else's greater good, right? That's fine. Go for it, because I'm all about, the greater good for everyone else, or they don't even say, yeah, kill me now because it's all right, I'm going to go to heaven. Guaranteed that there's going to be a large proportion of those 230,000 people in 2004 who died in that tsunami that are going to go, do you know what? I'm not a fan of dying now. Thank you very much, God. And I know you say you've got a reason, but still, I want to live a bit longer. Thank you very much. So informed consent is a really interesting idea with regard to this.
And it works both ways as well. What if you're really miserable and you're really old and you're really in pain and you want to die, but that God keeps prolonging your life? Again, and you just want out.
Yeah, and it's like pro-life people saying, "Oh no, euthanasia. Yeah, we can't." It's like, no, I really want to die now. I'm happy. Apparently, heaven is waiting. I really want to go there. Like now, no. Okay, it's just some more pain. Okay, thank you.
But remember, under the religious doctrine, yourself is not for you to decide what to do with it. The Creator pretty much owns you. He can do whatever. It was so evident in Job and the devil. The very last scene when Job was telling God, "Why did you do that to me? I loved you. I've done everything I could." And so, who are you? You're scumbag. Like, where were you when I was creating the universe? Shut the hell up, sort of thing.
Yeah. And I really don't like this. I've created you, therefore I can do with you what I like. This divine right over our lives that permits God to be able to do any horrendous act. Because we talked about this before, which is that if God is forced, believers are forced into these positions where they have to keep God and Jesus and the Bible up here. No matter what, it has to remain perfect and up here. So therefore, if you then present all these like examples of suffering and evil, then it has to be humans' fault for all of that, because God can't be at fault. And if you say, well, actually, humans can't be at fault for a tsunami, really, blah, 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 or it's quite difficult to argue that. And so therefore they say, okay, if it is God's fault, how do I get around this? So then they say, well, God is not a moral agent and God has the right to do what to humans however he likes. And you're like, that's the only way they can get out of it. But it's just like, well, no, why does God have the right to destroy why is God not a moral agent? I don't agree with the philosophy that
But
underwrites
how
that.
can you not be a moral agent and be called benevolent at the same time? You know, it
And
makes
how
no
can
sense.
you say God is love and God is not a moral agent? I don't
The
understand.
only type of God that will sort of fit the bill here, we're talking about the God of Spinoza, the
Yeah,
indifferent
yeah,
nature. Nature is
yeah,
indifferent, and we actually kind of know it's to be true because
yeah.
the amount of horrible things that happen while we're asleep in the jungles and the forest, it's indifferent. It does not understand good or evil.
Yeah, certainly what it looks like. And there's this position in philosophy called phenomenal conservatism. Phenomenal conservatism says if it looks like a duck and walks like a duck, it probably is a duck. Unless you've got a defeater that to show you what to defeat your position. So we're saying there is gratuitous evil, and look at these tsunamis, look at this Ebola, look at this cancer. Then we're probably justified in saying that actually that looks gratuitous because it is gratuitous, absent of any defeaters. Because the only defeater that comes back is, oh, God moves in mysterious ways, or there could be a reason. Yeah, but that you can use to argue for a unicorn, right? So that is not a defeater to my position that this, unless you've really got a good defeater, I'm justified in believing that this suffering is gratuitous.
Yeah,
there you go.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
So I was going to say we haven't even gotten to our first argument yet. It's half an hour through. That's what I love. I love a good bit of conversation. So the first argument is the accidents of geography and history. And there's a great book by John Loftus called The Outsider Test for Faith. In The Outsider Test for Faith, what he does is he says his argument is that people don't analyze their own religions well enough. They're really good at analyzing other people's religions. So to take a Christian, they'd say, well, Islam's wrong and atheism's wrong for this, and all these positions are wrong, but they don't apply the same metric to their own selves as they do to others. And so there is this like position of a plurality of religions causing quite a bit of a problem. And Loftus, indeed, in the book, in page 37 to 38 of his book, I'll read a quote if you don't mind. The main problem religious diversity presents us with is that not every religious faith can be true. In fact, given the number of mutually exclusive religious faiths in the world, it's highly likely that the one you inherited in your respective culture is false, given the odds alone. Robin McKim tells us that it, quote, is clear, therefore, that large numbers of people have held and now hold false beliefs in the area of religion. At most, one of them can be true. And since so many people hold false beliefs in the area of religion, it would seem, therefore, that all groups need to consider the possibility that their beliefs in this area may be mistaken. So the idea, if we return to what we talked about previously, which are abductive arguments. So the first thing to say about this is that an abductive argument is inference is the best explanation. What either better predicts data or better explains the data, right? So the data is plurality of religions, all loads of people, billions of people believing different religions. Okay. Is this better explained by naturalistic atheism, or is it better explained by omni-God Christianity, for example, or Islam, any particular type of omni-God belief? And I would say, just before anything, the fact that there's a plurality of believers, which means most people have got the wrong belief throughout history and geography, this is prima facie evidence that God doesn't exist. And God was really interested in people living in loving union with him, everyone would believe the right thing. Or the only other option is it doesn't matter what you believe. And if that's the case, if it doesn't matter what you believe, then what's the point in believing any particular religion? There's no benefit of any particular religion. In that case, it doesn't matter about the Bible. Because so there's a two-horn dilemma for, say, the Christian. I mean, I could talk about any particular denomination of belief. Does that all make sense so far?
Yeah, well, that's a classic response to Pascal's wager using mathematics, really, using numbers, because he was inferring that his equations based on just the one sample of binary of yes, there's God, and that God is the God of Christianity, or no, of none, and therefore your chance is 50-50. But when you actually apply the real numbers of what we have, 4,200, maybe more, because I think there are many gods as the number of people, to be honest with you, on Earth. And then when you do that number, the likelihood of you being wrong is actually way more than you being right. Just numbers.
Yes, yeah, I totally agree. And so you get into these weird situations. So what the Christian then has to do, and I use Christian here as an example, but it could be any denomination of any religion. What the Christian does, Southern Baptist Christian, has to do is say, right, okay, this is a bit difficult here, because really, if my particular religion is the one true religion, then most people on earth have got the wrong religion. How do we explain that? And then you're like, well, some people lived even before the Bible was written, like, and they can't have accessed, the redemptive quality of Jesus and the knowledge of the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible. How do we explain that? Because it looks like God is unfair, because he's created a situation where certain people just either don't have access to God, or if you're born in
Jonathan, considering as well, there's one element that makes this absolutely, it really makes it even worse, because when you think about these 4,200 religions, let's say that number does exist, you're not born and you're a clear slate and you're saying, hey, here's your 4,200 religion, please pick one. But it's actually determined by where you're born and when you were born. 95% of people will not venture outside of those sort of domains. So your opportunity of where you were born and what time you were born will actually pretty much dictate what you're going to be. And we have no control over that.
Yeah. So if you're born in Riyadh, you're going to be a Muslim. Like, pretty much, this done and dusted. There might be a very small chance that you might not be, but then you're going to be persecuted or have to do it in in secret. But so the issue is that if God is all loving, how does this all get like squared? I mean, what is going on here? So then you get all these kind of weird and wonderful like techniques that people like William Lane Craig use, which is like, oh, okay, I have to explain this, right? How do I do that? And then they say, well, everyone's got a soul, and it's like your soul either freely rejects or freely accepts God. And therefore, all the people that like Amazonian tribes people living 5,000 years ago before the Bible, they had souls that freely would reject God. Right, so then God front loads all those souls into these Amazonian tribes people and all these people around the world and time that would never have had the chance of accessing God's love. And then you're thinking, well, that's bizarre anyway. I mean, it's just an ad hoc kind of bolt-on theory that has no evidence to it. All you're doing is saying, what can I present that gets God off the hook? Here's something that could happen. And then you're thinking, well, then God is creating a whole bunch of people that are going to go, that if he already knows straight up the front that they are going to reject him, why create them? Why create a whole series of souls, literally running into the billions, who he knows is going to reject him, and then condemn them to some kind of punishment? You are just creating people to condemn them to punishment. It's horrible.
I love the sleight of hand that moves from possible to probable, so therefore it happened.
Yeah. Possibility ergo probability. It's the most common fallacy I mention because I come across it so often. This could be what happened, therefore it's probably what happened, therefore it is what happened. And it's like, hang on, how do you get from there to there? And so you get, William Lane Craig says, well, this is what explains that. It's like, hang on, that's just a conceptual possibility, and it also makes God look like a complete plonker. So yeah,
and it also poses the again, it needs a theodicy of its own, which is God's justice. If the stake is heaven and hell, most of us would have loved to be born into an era where Jesus wasn't around, or the revelation you were not sort of have to adhere to, because if this is the case, if you're going to end up being in heaven anyway because you were not witnessing God's word or might, so those people who were born in that era, they're kind of blessed because they're under no obligation to accept anything at this point. You just have a free pass.
None of it makes any sense. I've come to the conclusion. So in this particular argument about the geography and history, I present a syllogism at the end of the chapter, but basically you've got a really weird situation. I mean, like that dilemma is either God rearranges a world such that all the people that are going to reject him are people that never were going to hear the correct, revelation at all, or it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what you believe, and both of those answers just are unsatisfactory. So I think this is a problem that I don't think has ever been adequately answered, and it is a pretty obvious problem. It's like, like just go to Bible Belt America and say, yeah, brilliant, lovely, great service, I love your mega church, brilliant, lovely, but how come there's like 2 billion Muslims in the world? Like, literally, what's going on there? Because if God has designed the world such that most of the people don't believe in him, then God's done a pretty rubbish job of designing the world.
It's insane. Jonathan, have you heard about the latest consensus in Australia?
Yeah, so I don't know what the stats are.
So we moved. I think the last one was 3 years ago. The irreligious moved from 29% to a staggering 41% of the Australian society. That's incredible. And I bet you the 59%, they just still culturally identify. They were just putting the consensus Christian, but they're not practicing. Yeah. So it's incredible numbers. And that defeats God's idea. So obviously the number of irreligious people, after being well informed, they are still rejecting God. So that argument's gone out of the window.
Yes. And so then we can look on to further arguments to do with unfairness, God's unfairness, and why people believe. And the next argument is the unfair levels of evidence. So just straight up, like, let's take Gospel of John and Doubting Thomas, right? So Doubting Thomas, he's like being, and I may have talked about this with you in a previous video, but he was like one of Jesus' mates, hung around with him, saw him do loads of funky miracles. Like, this guy like knows that Jesus is pretty special. Like, he's seen it all. He's like, wow, he can like resurrect Lazarus and all this kind of stuff, water to wine, amazing. And then Jesus dies and it resurrects. And then Thomas goes, oh, I'm not sure that, like, he's got him in front. He's literally standing in front of him. And he goes, so I don't mean to laugh, but honestly, it's such a silly story. And he's standing in front of him and he goes, no, I don't believe it's you. And then Jesus says, honestly, it's me. And then, poke my holy hands. And then he pokes his hands and he goes, oh, it is you. Turns out it's you. Type thing. Obviously, I'm being facetious. But the idea is that Thomas there then becomes St. Thomas and he goes up to heaven and has a wonderful existence in heaven for eternity. And yet he didn't believe that Jesus had resurrected when Jesus was standing in front of him, right? And he knew him all his life. Right. So how come we get to just read a 2,000-year-old book and we're supposed to believe? Right. And and yet he's a saint in heaven. And what God said, God literally presented him with the highest level of evidence you can imagine, which is getting to poke Jesus's hands.
Jonathan, in the Quran, there is a verse about it. This is not in the Bible. I think you find it in some uncanonized gospels, the story between Abraham and Allah in the Quran, where Abraham is talking to God. He's talking to God. He's witnessing God. He's walking with him. And, he's God's mate. And suddenly say, like, can you just give me some extra evidence? Because, I know I believe in everything, but I just want my heart to really believe. And God, obliges and he said, look, get these 10 birds, cut them into pieces, and I'm going to bring them back to life for you. So he's actually, so this is, and then they're asking us to sort of believe because of the Shroud of Turin.
yeah. Just so there is clearly, this goes back to the history and geography argument that we just had as well. So there are some people who have had literally zero, like an Amazonian tribesperson has zero evidence of believing because they're living in a forest, like nothing to do with Jesus or whatever. And then you've got you've got this whole range of people believing and the amount of people believe and a whole range of different evidences. So like just a little quote, the only way God could deal with this potential unfairness is by having some kind of metric for judgment that allows for everyone's causal circumstance to be taken into account. Person X believed in God 69%, but only with a 32% evidential basis. But what of person Y, who believed 90%, on an evidential basis of 12%? And how about person Z, who believed 15% but only had 2% evidential basis, and all the combinations thereof? So you've all got this combinations of how much evidence you've got and how much you believe. And the only way you can get around that is if God has some weird matrix where he judges people based on like putting that into a function machine, and it throws out a judgment of heaven or hell, you know, and it's just, the whole thing's just nuts. So what I created in the book, and I've done this in a bunch of different interviews. I'm just going to read you a fairly lengthy quote, if I may. But but what this does is I think is a really good analogy that shows how, if life is a test, right, and we're getting judged on a test, then it's really desperately unfair as a test. You got to remember that if life is a test, and you can look at Adam and Eve, was that a test? You know, it was a fall, you know, God, don't do this, they've gone and done it. I was testing them, they failed. Tests only make sense as a teacher if the teacher doesn't know what state of knowledge the children or the students have, right? So the reason a teacher tests someone or a class is because I don't know what you know. I need to test what you know. So I've got some kind of quantification of your knowledge state. But if I was an omni-God, right, I wouldn't need to test anyone. I don't need to test anyone because I know straight away what all of your abilities and knowledges and what you would do in any given situation is. In fact, I don't think I'd even need to create you because I just know straight away without creating you what you would do. Right. So the whole testing idea is a bit broken anyway, because omni-God makes very little sense of testing. But if that's what floats your boat, Christian, if you think we're getting judged by our actions based on, you know, some kind of test, then get a load of this. Is there anything you want to say to that already?
Well, I've always thought about testing, because when we have to sort of compare testing, we compare it to our own method of testing. It's not that you test because you don't know the knowledge, but it's got an end to that testing. You test students because you want to prepare them for a practical life, being an engineer or a doctor. You want to make sure that they have the necessary skills so they can navigate life and perform a certain job to the best of their ability so they can benefit others. But when the test itself, the end game of it is this is how you get away, not being burnt alive every single moment to infinity. It makes the whole testing thing kind of ridiculous. Testing in humanity, it's pragmatic. It's got a purpose. It's got very well justified purpose. You want your doctor, who's going to be looking after you, to have passed certain tests and being completely competent about how they're going to go about treating you. And that would make complete sense. And if they fail, they just fail to be a doctor, and they might end up being a musician as a result.
This is a really interesting point. So what you're saying is testing doesn't have intrinsic value. So
Exactly
the intrinsic,
right.
it doesn't have value in and of itself. You use testing to inform you of certain things so that you can either improve that person, or you don't know enough, so therefore you need to know more. Let's get some more knowledge into you. Or you don't know enough, and actually you're not going to be good enough for this, so how about doing this or whatever. But of course, this kind of ultimate testing for humanity, where you go to hell and that's it, and there's no rehabilitation there at all, so there's no intrinsic value to hell. It's just as in there's no transformative value to hell,
No.
or seemingly to heaven, then it's rendered even more senseless. Yeah, absolutely. So the quote from page 63 and 4 is this: and I can supposedly go to hell based on whether I choose to believe that very low level biblical evidence. Let's call it 5%. Yet St. Thomas the Apostle gets to stroll through the pearly gates. One assumes on the back of not believing, assuming the Gospels are true here, even though he is presented with a level of, say, 85%. And Jesus then reversing this unbelief in the resurrection, Jesus' divinity and the whole atonement idea. Not that Thomas actually would have understood this at the time, I wager, by getting Thomas to poke him and raising the evidential threshold to 95%. No, I'm making these figures up to illustrate my point. The Christian believer could counter the different people react differently to differing levels of evidence and concoct some kind of counter-apologetic. My general point would be, yes, all sorts of people will react differently to the same level of evidence, and all sorts of people get different levels of evidence. It's all a bit of an unfair mess. Time for another analogy. Imagine I have a class of 30 children to whom I give a test. All 30 children have different brains, knowledge bases, abilities, and thresholds, etc. I give them a test of 100 questions and declare that the children who fail to get 70 out of 100 will get detention. That means hell. Children who get 70 will get a special treat, heaven. I then give them a test, except I also give out different cheat sheets to everyone ranging from 0 points of help to 95 points. Each child either gets no extra help or gets some kind of leg up to getting closer to that 70-point success. So think about, some people get like revelations from God, or, you know, that other people don't. Some
like
people,
Paul.
Exactly. Some people, like little Thomas, get a cheat sheet with answers worth 95 points. Lucky him. Poor Alice, who is not very clever, due to her genetics and troublesome environment, gets a cheat sheet with 0 points of help and gets 16 out of 100 and detention. We could actually make this more sinister, accurate. Some children are given trickster cheat sheets, like our Saudi student Mo, who gets a sheet that actually tells him wrong answers and leaves him with 35 points less than he would have got on his own. He gets 50 points and receives a detention. Perhaps as a teacher, I actually take in the answers, but don't announce to anyone the results until the end of the school day. In the meantime, I plug their results into a matrix that calculates an outcome based on 1, abilities, 2, environment, 3, cheat sheets, and 4, their results. I then use these calculated results to enforce on them a detention or a reward. That's what the Christian would have to think. But the whole notion of this, but then it gets even worse. So imagine you are a teacher that's you've given out all your cheat sheets. Some of them are wrong. Some of them are tricks of sheets. Some of them are good sheets. You've got a whole class doing a whole load of different things. But then whilst they're doing that, you're prodding them with a cattle prod. You're literally giving them pain. So it's like, I'm giving you a test, but at the same time, it's like I'm giving you cancer and Ebola and prodding you with a cattle prod. And you over there, you're going to get genocide. You're going to get murdered in this test. And after the test, some of you get detention and some of you get a reward. It's like, I don't get it.
It's crazy. It is. I just don't know how this. It's really insane to think about this. And for me, there's no way out. There's just no way that this proposes a fair God. We're talking about like 100-meter sprint, and you get positioned. Some people positioned right like 5 meters before the end, and some are probably behind the line.
You've seen that viral video on Privilege, maybe that
Yes.
does that. They literally get those people and say, right, you get to start here, and you've won the race. Well done, you. You know, you started 95 meters in, but that's exactly the same principle. Yeah. So it makes little sense. So I've had this, I wrote a whole bunch of posts on this when I was writing back at Pathos Non-Religious, and a Christian apologist, Catholic apologist called Dave Armstrong he was obsessed with me, strangely. So he used to try and write all these counter apologist stuff. Counter apologist stuff against me, and he'd write these big pieces, and then I'd pick his pieces apart because they were useless. Anyway, one of the things I did all this doubting Thomas stuff, and he said, yeah, but everyone has sufficient evidence. And I was like, as an answer to like, why don't you put a cross on the moon? And he's like, well, everyone's got sufficient evidence. So I said, well, I don't think you understand what sufficient means. So here's an analogy, Dave, right? You give me 5 liters of fuel, of gas, of petrol, and you say that is sufficient fuel to get you from where you are now to Portsmouth, Fareham to Portsmouth. And I say, okay, if I put that in my Vauxhall Zafira now, then that will get me to Portsmouth. Well done, that is sufficient fuel. But if I put it in my Humvee, right, that ain't going to get me to Portsmouth. And if I put it in my other Zafira that's got a hole in the fuel tank, that won't get me to Portsmouth. And if I put it in my Ferrari, that won't get me to Portsmouth. If I put it in my electric car, that won't get me to Portsmouth. If I put it on my bicycle, so the idea of what's sufficient is what Dave Armstrong was saying is, I believe he was projecting. So he said, I've got sufficient evidence, and if I've got this amount of evidence, and I believe, therefore everyone has access to the same evidence and they should believe. So what he was saying is, what's sufficient for Dave Armstrong is sufficient for all humanity. It's like, no, everyone has different brains. Everyone has different environments. Everyone, etc., etc. And also, people don't just get that level of evidence anyway. They get differing levels of evidence. But the same level of evidence is not going to be good enough for everyone. For example, if you were the son of a NASA engineer, right? You were the son of a NASA engineer who worked on the moon landing in '69, right? And I came and presented you with the evidence that the moon landing was a conspiracy theory and it didn't happen, right? And I present you with an amount of evidence. You would likely go, that is obviously nonsense. I don't believe it because my dad worked on that and blah 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 blah. But if I went to a conspiracy theorist who believes in chemtrails and all this stuff and said, the same amount of evidence, the moon landings are fake, they're going to lap it up and they're going to say, yeah, moon landings are fake, right? Same evidence, different people, one believes, one doesn't, right? In other words, sufficiency does not work when you are talking about belief.
Yeah. If you recall William Lane Craig in the Kalam cosmological argument, he does his first, he gets 20 minutes first and he does all his great stuff. But at the very end, he smuggles that you're going to open your heart to a person relationship with Jesus, your God and Savior. And only by believing in him and you letting him in, that he comes in and shows you the way in the best possible way to you. And that becomes also an argument of, tell me what makes you, what would be the thing that would make you believe in God. And I think people like, what's the name of the gentleman from the Atheist Experience? Matt Dillahunty. And several others would, and I'd say the same. Well, if God knows me that well, he would know exactly what would make me believe. So that's it. Some people...
The sufficiency works for each individual, just not as a universal principle as one amount is sufficient for everyone. So it's like, if you really want everyone to believe, go to them individually and provide them with the amount of evidence that is sufficient for them to believe, but rather than have this completely unfair distribution of evidence and sufficiencies as well. And that's just so with Craig, of course, that's his own epistemic sort of failsafe, isn't it? So he says, in the Reasonable Faith, in his book, and in general, he sets out the fact that, okay, here's all the evidential reasons to believe in God, and he'll say, the resurrection, the empty tomb, blah 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 blah, all that kind of stuff, Kalam, all that. And then he'll go, but really, even if you show all those things to be fake, I've got the inner witness of the Holy Spirit. So that trumps everything, and therefore, end of conversation. Because you're like, well, okay, so he's basically admitted that even if all those things were proved to be wrong, he would still believe anyway. Well, it's not a conversation we can have then.
Yeah. So, and that's why I thought the religion situation is, you've got the writing like the Quran, and it's supposed to be objective, a universal objective message, but as a receiver, it be transcoded into a subjective message, because you will receive it based on your IQ, your culture, the way you understand things, your personal experiences, and the way you interpret situations, whether one is cruel or one is being merciful and all that sort of stuff. Then you end up with your own interpretation of that message. Therefore, God's message is never going to be objective. No. Once it's transferred into human brain and perception, it will always end up being subjective.
This is very much like Immanuel Kant's Kantian position. So Kant said, to do with sort of knowledge, he said you can never know a thing in and of itself. Ding an sich. I always get that wrong. One's rude. A ding an sich. So he said you can't know a thing in and of itself. But any kind of object that you look at, you can't know. In the same way, you can't know what it feels like to be a bat. You look at a TV monitor, you don't know what it. You don't know what it is to be that. You don't have knowledge of that thing. You've only got your perceptual knowledge of that. So everything is interpreted through your own perceptual lens. So this is kind of like phenomenal, like representation of things. And the same goes for all the evidence for the Bible and for any kind of revelation, is that you are always interpreting it subjectively. And in fact, this is kind of almost segues on to the next sort of bunch of arguments.
Then, Jonathan, if God then chooses certain people to give them that person revelation, and if he's done that, because he's an almighty, right? He can do everything. He can do 8.5 billion people instantly and at the same time of direct download into your brain with exactly what hits the spot.
This is the thing about belief, is that you can always posit that God can do perpetual miracles and stuff. So like nothing's impossible for God. So why is it not that way? And of course, like the Christian goes, God moves in mysterious ways all the time. So, oh, really? We're there again, are we? Okay. So the last one about unfairness and levels of evidence and whatnot is that certain people have greater chance and greater disposition for believing in God than others. So it turns out that women are more likely to believe in God than men. I was called out a little bit on this because it does depend how you define empathy, and there is different research into autistic people, but there is some research to suggest that certain autistic people, and I know it's a huge spectrum and loads of caveats to go along with that. I mean, I've got an autistic son, so et cetera, but there are the two really interesting 2012 paper by Nuran Zayan and Gervais and Trzewski, saying that certain people with autistic traits have mentalizing deficits, which means an inability to put themselves in other people's shoes. This is called intersubjectivity. So the idea that you can imagine what someone else is thinking of you by putting yourself in their shoes and looking back at you. And if you don't have the ability to do that very well, then actually what it looks like is you're far less likely to believe in God, because most people that believe in God are always thinking, what does God think about me? If I go and do this thing, oh, God's looking, what's God thinking? Or if you go outside and you like, shall I do this, do that? Oh, what's God thinking? If you can't do that, if you don't have that intersubjectivity, it turns out that you're far less likely to believe in God. The point is, it doesn't really matter what the reasons are. It doesn't matter why women are more likely to believe in God than men. It might be environmental, it might be genetic, it might be biological, it might be all of them, right? Together. I don't really care. The fact is that if you've created a world in which some people are more likely to believe in God than others, you have created an unfair world.
True.
So don't care who the groups are, what the reason is. If some people are more likely to believe in you than others, then you are disadvantaging some people and privileging other people as they're born or throughout their lives.
I was wondering if you want to spice things up and Otangelo is in the house. And
we're not talking about the Shroud of Turin, no. Only one argument is relevant. How can we exist without a creator? I have never seen Jonathan or any other atheists giving. So what I'm going to challenge Otangelo Grasso back, because this is what a classic troll does, right? A troll does, and I have enough of them on my own blogs and columns. And Otangelo does this all the time. So he'll go and he'll ignore everything that's been said. So he hasn't picked up on a single thing that we have discussed to this point, and he has his own agenda. He says, I've got this one thing in my head, and I'm going to challenge you on that. No. This is our space now, mate. Right? If you want to say something, how about you debunk everything that I've said? How about you challenge any one of the things I've said? So no, I'm not going to deal with your question. I'm sorry. I mean, I could do. It'd be quite interesting. This is what is it? This is about how can we exist without a creator?
I think that
whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, it's either, I presume that's some kind of Kalam argument where you can.
Yeah, everything begins to exist has a cause. We exist, therefore we have a cause.
Yeah, you can go and read my book on the Kalam. So, did God create the universe from nothing? You can go and read that. But in the meantime, no, Otangelo, you need to actually deal with the content of this video. So you've come to this video, we have presented a bunch of stuff, and you are doing a bait and switch. You're not even baiting, you're just switching. You're like, you want us to deal with something else. So no, you deal with this, and you come back with some counter arguments to the things we've said, and then we can deal with that.
That's a good point. I mean, we're sort of discussing 30 different arguments. You can pick any one and say, "Hey, I disagree with that one here."
And I love it. I love his comeback to that. So basically, avoiding my question. No, not avoiding question. You are avoiding literally 1 hour and 4 minutes of what we've said. So don't come here and demand that we dance to your music, right? You come here and you deal with what we have said. I want your explanation, not only in regards to the origin of the university. You're not going to get it. Read my book. Go and read my book. It's in there. The laws of physics, origin of life, consciousness. No, you deal with all the arguments we've said, because that's why this video is here, right? This isn't the Ortangelo Grasso video. This is us talking about a bunch of arguments that we have laid out, and you have not involved yourself with those arguments in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, so we can dub this one a red herring at this point, yeah.
Exactly, and you know what? And I apologise for sounding a bit like angered, but I've had Ortangelo Grasso coming onto videos and either mine or other people's and saying the same stuff, but actually not dealing with
it is frustrating. I agree. It is frustrating when you spend time trying to address something and then somebody is asking you, what's that to do with the price of eggs, or like it's completely different.
And I'm not denying that's not an interesting question that he's got there, isn't it? I've written a book on it, so I'm obviously fairly interested in it, but it's just not for now. Like deal with this. So right, the next set of questions are moral questions, right? Or the next set of arguments. So it's the section in the book, part 3 of the moral life. Okay. Now, I think I laid this out to you in the very first video, because this is super important to my entire worldview, and it's the basis of is a lot. I talk about this a lot in my previous book, Why I Am Atheist and Not Atheist, and the basis of this is ontology. So ontology is the existence, arguments to do with the existence. What is the world made of? And in this case, the important thing to talk about are what are abstract ideas made of. So I am what's called a conceptual nominalist, and I say that abstract ideas are concepts that only exist in our minds, and we conceive them. If we're all to die, if all sentient life was to die, there would be no abstract ideas. There would be no mathematics. There would be no, because mathematics is a language we have constructed to understand reality. There would be, the idea of what a hero is. My idea of what a hero is probably different from yours, Hanney, right? And which means that there isn't an objective idea of a hero, an objective exemplification of a hero. We have our own opinions, and when we agree, we end up writing dictionaries, and when we agree, we end up writing encyclopedias, and when we agree, we end up writing laws, or we vote people in. If we all agree, we vote for the same people in that are going to write those things into law, and then we hope they are enforced. But morality, as much as the idea of a hero or a chair or a dog or Jonathan Pearce, doesn't exist out there. It exists in here. So my idea of who Jonathan Pearce is going to be very different from your idea, and I can tell you, very different from my partner. I think I'm honest, kind, generous, loving. My partner thinks, oh God, well, he's this. Who's correct? Who's got the correct idea of who Jonathan Pearce is, right? So there's disagreement all the time because there isn't an objective Platonic reality. Plato used to think there were these perfect forms and we would be like sitting at the back of a cave looking at the reflection on a cave wall in firelight, and that's our understanding of reality. But there would be perfect forms that exist. I deny that there aren't perfect forms. We die, all conceptual, all the concepts die with us. So given that, that's a really quick basis. I'd set that out in a lot more depth in the aforementioned book. Morality, I am essentially a moral skeptic, which means morality doesn't exist out there, at least. Morality exists in here, and it exists in here in all of us. So when we agree, we can write moral laws, but when we disagree, we have philosophical arguments. And the part of the data point of how I know this to be true, or I've got good reason to think this is true, is that we've had 4,000 years of moral philosophy, 3,000 years of moral philosophy, and no one still agrees on moral philosophy.
Mhm.
And the Phil Papers studies will show you that, or surveys will show you that there are broadly three main families of moral philosophy: virtue ethics, consequentialism, and deontology.
And that's on the theoretical level. So imagine on the practical level, we can see actually morality. If there's a PowerPoint graph, it changes. It's never constant. It changes with our knowledge, with the things we know better. And I'm pretty sure it's going to change. I think in a few hundred years, people are going to probably look back and say, "Oh, imagine humanity used to slaughter and kill animals and eat their flesh."
Yeah, exactly. And so therefore, yeah, what that means is very important. What it generally means is that certain claims in the Bible seem to be thoroughly problematic. When you have absolute moral laws, that some of the laws in the Bible are, for example, you've got problem. But it's better explains everything. Now, what Christians generally do, or any kind of theist generally, or monotheist, will say that okay, God grounds moral laws. So they are, in a sense, they might even be sort of conceptual nominalists, but they say it doesn't exist objectively, just in the mind of God. But of course, that's just a subjective mind itself. And we start getting to problems of divine command theory, and that's the first place I'm going to go to. There can be no good or bad without God. Molecules do not care about your sex life. So molecules don't care about your sex life. You're right. There can be good or bad if we say something is good or something is bad using moral reasoning. Now, here's the problem for someone like Atangelo Grasso here, is that he probably would use something like divine command theory.
Mm-hmm.
What is divine command theory? And to be honest, what I'm telling you now, I'm going to have to be super quick with, because this is like an hour's video in and of itself. Just divine command theory. So divine command theory basically says what God says is that's what makes it good, right? God's commands are good on account of them being God's nature. And you have the Euthyphro dilemma, which is like, is what makes it good? Is it good because God says it is, or is God saying it's good because it's good like outside of God, in which case you won't need God for that. But then if God's saying it's good because God says it's good, then it looks like might makes right, or God's just, and you've got these arbitrary. So this is a classic old, Greek thought.
I think was it Euthyphro?
Yeah.
That's on the back of Socrates, conversation with Socrates. Yeah.
Exactly. So I've got like 16 arguments against divine command theory, right? So very quickly, I'll try and rush through them, but each of them probably demand dwelling on. First one is arbitrariness. There's no third-party benchmark, so the idea of goodness becomes arbitrary. So if you're saying God, and then even if you say, well, it's in God's nature, you say, well, what makes God's nature good? Because you sometimes see this. It's not just because God commands it. It actually comes from his nature. It's the same problem. So, we cannot use some other moral reasoning or scale to morally rationalize God's nature, as this would then become the moral grounding itself. And this process would not necessitate God. But if God is that grounding, what makes its commands good are merely arbitrary assertions lacking any such rationalizations. Now, the problem here, divine command theory demands that we cannot use moral reasoning to derive moral value, because if you use moral reasoning, that is a source of the moral value. So this is the real problem, is they have to say God is good, but then when you say why is God good or how is God good, they cannot give a reason other than God. So God is good. So it's like this circular argument. God is good because God, because good, because God, because good, because God.
Especially, Jonathan, under this particular argument, when God commands one thing and its opposite in a different area, and one is deemed to be the right thing and the good thing to do, like preserving life, then he would demand you take life and maybe rape that life before you take it. And then it becomes good too because God commanded it to be. So which is good and which is bad? Killing or not to kill?
There you go. So that's the first problem, the arbitrariness, and that's a really fundamental problem that underwrites so many of the other problems. So second problem, direction of causality. The direction of causality works like this. God has lovingness, mercy, and kindness, etc. But these are not good on their own merit, because goodness is rooted in God. These are good because God has them. they do not make God good. So God is not good because he has lovingness, right? Because he is kindness. Do you understand what I'm saying? Because if that's what makes you good, then that is what grounds goodness, just being kind or loving. But they are good because God has them. They are not good in and of themselves. So when I say to you, oh, that's really nice, Hanney, you were really kind the other day when you did whatever, right? The only way I can make sense of that is that's only good. That kindness is only good because God has it. It's not good because I can talk to you about why there's moral reasons why kindness is good and what you did was good and gave good consequences or whatever. I can't do any of that because the only reason that's good is because God has it. And this is kind of like, I suppose, where Artangelo has to go because he's not. He's just asserted that God underwrites morality. You can't do good or bad without God. But he doesn't explain how that is so. That's just a massive assertion, and it lacks any kind of moral grounding. But anyway, so if we ask why human lovingness is good, it is because it reflects God and not for any other reason. Justice and lovingness are only good on account of God having them, not because they obtain any good consequences within or for society or have intrinsic moral value or for any other moral reasoning. So that's the second problem. Are you with me so far?
Mm-hmm.
So this then leads on to the third problem, which is we are only good if we are reflecting God. So thinking about that previous point, if you use divine command theory, then when you're being good, you cannot use moral reasoning to define that goodness, only that it reflects God. Moral reasoning cannot ground morality because then the grounding would not be in God. And this leads to the weird scenarios. You did that. That was really great. Thank you. You did that. And it reflected God. And that's why it was good. End of conversation. There's nothing else you can say to that, which makes it a really kind of vacuous, empty statement, I would say. The fourth argument against divine command theory is that moral reasoning, it defies everyday moral reasoning and intuition. So, for example, an action such as rape is wrong for us because of the harm it causes. But for the divine command theorist, it's because God commanded us not to rape. Although he kind of endorsed it in the Old Testament, but we can come on to that later. We say, look how horrible rape is, look at the harm it does. But this in itself does not make it wrong for the divine command theories, because rape carries no intrinsic or extrinsic moral value, since the moral value appears to be in following a command of God or reflecting him as much as possible. Of course, this seems patently ridiculous. None of this plays well with our sense of moral intuition. So we have this moral intuition that certain things are bad, and then we can kind of actually rationalize why they're bad. But none of that is correct because it's only bad because God commanded it so. And it's in God's nature. Then the fifth argument is which God and which commands. So this is an epistemic problem, this epistemological problem, which is, or how do I know I've got the right God? If I'm going to try and be moral, right, how do I know that God's the correct one and not that one? And how do I know that command that's written there is a correct command and that I've interpreted correctly, as you earlier said, which is there's an interpretative lens through which I'm interpreting all of these commands. And are they relevant for us now? I mean, that was 3,000, 2,000 years ago. You know.
Like thou shalt not kill, and then interpret it again into murder, and then it's no, not all killing is a murder, and then you have to explain that away. Yeah,
exactly. So this is the argument from divine miscommunication. It's just like, well, there's a complete lack of clarity, and this doesn't augur well for the people who argue for divine command theory. It's just a real problem. Sixth argument, genocide, and again, you can dwell on each of these points for ages, but time and space. So genocide and ordinary morality. So the idea that God commanded genocide in the Old Testament is also problematic and does not fit well with ordinary morality. But given DCT, divine command theory, it must be morally good. Or is it just good sometimes? This potentially gets you into an uncomfortable reality. DCT depends on who is doing the commanding. So genocide from God, good. Genocide from Hitler, bad. Okay. And it all starts to look like the context and the moral relativism that comes out of contextualizing these moral values. So Hitler gets a lot of bad press for his terrible genocide, God less so, and the scales are a bit skewed there.
This is an interesting one. This is the argument from objective morals, because objective morality exists, therefore God exists.
Okay, so I just completely contest that, and I contest it from an ontological point of view.
Yeah.
So in order to argue that, he has to either, I mean, it's either a circular argument, so it's already implying God, because objective morality can only be embedded within God. So if you're saying objective morality is defined by God, then you're saying objective morality can only exist with God. Well, yeah, because you've defined it into God. So, okay. But
it's a
then
false
if you're saying,
dichotomy.
well, it's literally begging the question as a formal fallacy. And the second option is objective morality exists out there. Well, you have to present why Platonic realism is true and why I should believe that. So just asserting that. So I would say that it's always wrong to torture babies for fun. Well, what if someone came up to you with a baby and said, right, if you don't torture this, I will torture all of humanity and kill them straight away? So you can always think of like these particular weird scenarios, and then you can say, well, a Kantian would say it's still wrong to torture that baby, and then you say a consequentialist would say it's not wrong. Well, who's right? Well, it depends what moral value system you take. Okay, well, okay, so we're doing a lot of moral reasoning here, etc., etc. So these questions have not been sorted out because, again, these are conceptual ideas that exist in here. So the problem with anyone saying objective anything abstract exists is I contest that straight away.
And Jonathan, if I can have a stab at this, I can completely explain this away through the normal evolutionary process of why humanity deems such act to be a bad one and not encouraged, because we don't want our children to be tortured. So we have evolved to live in a society where these sort of acts are not encouraged because we don't want them to happen to us. So therefore we have a social contract with our fellow humans not to do such a thing, and we condemn such a thing. Easy.
Yeah,
so
there are functional accounts for morality, and there are social accounts, and there are psychological accounts, like the golden rule or the platinum rule, even better than the golden rule. So I would say all of these things are relevant for constructing a framework of morality that we use pragmatically. But the fact that Ottangelo will say this, and yet his objective moral values will differ from another Christian's objective moral values, shows that it's just all complete nonsense. Like, it's still the epistemological problem, and it's as though he's not listening to what we're saying. Lo and behold, because I've just talked about this being an epistemological problem to do with interpretation, which God, which commands. All he can do is say that in some abstract sense that God underwrites objective morality, but he can't tell us what that objective morality is with any kind of certitude, because then I can just present him with all the examples in the Bible of that not being true, or contradictions, or other Christians believing differently that also claim that they have objective morality. And so it's just but the simple issue here is conceptual nominalism. Conceptual nominalism just completely destroys this. Anyway, and he needs to explain why is it that we can all have different ideas of what a hero is, without saying that he has to say that there is an objective instantiation of hero-ness out there.
Yeah, this sentence that he made, it can be debunked in a very, very simple area. Objective morality, I think, exactly, Jonathan, I'm with you. Morality is an abstract concept, and this is null and void if humanity ceased to exist. This concept.
Yes. Exactly. So that's exactly right, and that's the point. If all humanity existed, there wouldn't be morality. If there was no sentient being had the ability to conceive of morality, if all such creatures died out, there would be no morality, and that's just simply the truth. Now, well, I would say it's the truth. I am obviously asserting that, but you can go and read my books.
Unlike physical existence, so the moon, I think, it pre-existed us, and I think will exist maybe after our extinction. So these are not abstract.
But then this is where you get into differentiation between the moon as a bunch of properties and the moon as a label that we've ascribed to that. So the moon as a label will cease to exist. So the moon will cease to exist, even though the moon will continue to exist. So this is the important thing. So we attach labels to everything. And that form of labeling, and this is the same for personhood. It's why like arguments about personhood just don't work. It's
but at least, Jonathan, part of the moon will persist to exist. maybe not in the same context as we perceive it, but some part of it. But abstract statements will completely cease to
Yes,
exist,
exactly.
absence of minds.
Exactly. So, so just to continue, so genocide is obviously a bit of a problem. Argument number 7: is God a better stopping point? So theists have done nothing to show that God is a more appropriate stopping point than the moral properties of kindness, generosity, and justice themselves. Why is it, in any rational sense, that grounding morality in God is actually any better than grounding it in real and observable features of the world, such as the consequences of moral actions? There seems to be this assumption that a framework set outside of our minds and our reality, dictated by some being that we cannot access or remotely understand, is somehow better. This idea that why is God underwriting our morality better than us giving you really good reasons why morality is either good or bad, like using moral reasoning? Anyway,
Considering Jonathan, he was never neutral from day one. From day one, he had his favorite people. He preferred the offering of Cain's over Abel. He's always had certain favorites. He was never a neutral, unbiased source to begin with.
look at what Tangelo Grasso said again. You need to ground moral values without God. You can't do this. I've literally said, I don't do that. I don't need to do that. I don't ground morality. Like, there isn't objective morality. I'm not grounding it in anything other than when I construct it, I am constructing morality out of moral reasoning. Right. And it depends what I'm a moral skeptic. So literally no moral value system works. And we know this because, as I said already, after 3,000 years of moral philosophizing, no one agrees on it. Right. You would think that after this amount of time, if Otangelo was obviously correct, right, we'd all believe it. We don't. So he's not. He might be correct, but he's not obviously correct, and I would say he's not correct because of for all the reasons I've already given. But the idea here is that I don't need to ground morality. I construct morality, and I use psychology and I use rules of thumb that don't always work, and I have to use so for example, it's wrong to lie as a rule of thumb. That's a consequentialist rule of thumb, but sometimes there are exceptions. So sometimes it is good to lie.
So, Jonathan, I'll ask you a question here. I mean, I see morality as a tool.
Yeah.
I don't see it as an end game. I see it's a thing to help us socialize and do better together in engagement in society. I see it as a tool.
In evolutionary terms, yeah.
Exactly. If certain people see it as an end game, then they will always going to confine themselves to the absolute objective thing that exists outside in the sky, and it's supposed to be in eternity with God forever, sort of thing.
So you're absolutely right. So this is so morality is goal orientated. You're absolutely right. So being goal orientated is not an end in and of itself. You don't say you should be good. Why should you be good? Because you should be good. Like, it's not that you say, okay, why should you be good? Because it makes the world a better place. Okay, what do you mean by the world a better place? So the being good is a goal orientated mechanism to achieve some goal. Right. So the question is, what is a goal? And I don't know if I'm talked with you about this before, but what we fail to do often as a society, politically and socially, is sort out what kind of goal, what kind of world we want to live in. Right. Because when we sort out what world we want to live in, we can then talk about how we go about getting there, which is the morality bit. Right. But first of all, you sort out the goal. Then the moral mechanism comes in next, and actually it can in part be defined by the goal. So if I want a particular world that looks like this, where we don't torture people, for example, I'm being really simplistic, then the mechanism, the morality I use to get there shouldn't involve torturing people. In other words, the goal will influence the method I use, the journey, the kind of transport I use to get there. But the larger point is that you're absolutely right. Morality is a goal-orientated system, and it should all be about our destination.
So to hit someone is morally wrong, but if you add the context of you're hitting someone because this person is a bully and he's renowned for beating up on children and on other people, and you want to stop this person from doing any further harm, suddenly your act of violence is justified, well, morally, because the amount of people who are going to be or avoiding the punishment of this bully is going to be extended. But yet your act has a purpose of its own. It doesn't end there by you being a good or bad person. It extends to the actual society by saying, my act has stopped this bully from inflicting further harm.
Yeah. So this is rather like, like deontologists like Immanuel Kant would say, you know, things are bad, and they're always bad. It's a bit absolutist, a bit like it's wrong to lie, and he would call it a categorical imperative. Someone like Ottangelo Grasso says there are objective morality, they exist in God. It doesn't show any way in which that works, and doesn't even define whether it is lying wrong because God. How does that work? Right. And then how does it work? Because then it's not always true either. So, for example, the famous inquiring murderer. So a murderer comes around to your house and you've got Jack and Jill upstairs, these two kids upstairs playing in your upstairs room. Right. And you know, you're babysitting them. And the murderer says, oh, do you know where Jack and Jill is? Because I want to kill them. Right. And you would presumably go, no, I don't know where they are. I think I saw them run off down there.
It's, yeah, you have to tell them.
But according to Kant, you have to tell him. Now, what is it for Ottangelo Grasso? Because if it's a categorical imperative form of objective morality, then Ottangelo Grasso should have to tell the truth and say they're up there, in which case the murderer goes up and kills the children. So is there a contextuality to morality, or is it a kind of is it objective? Is it absolute? You know, but of course, just God underwrites morality, and then that does my moral value system. Great, I'm off down church. You know, it's like, no, mate, you've got to do a lot better than that. You know, if God doesn't exist, objective moral values don't exist. Objective moral values exist, therefore God exists, blah, 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 blah. Oh, look, isn't that wonderful? I've done morality.
And moral judgment has become so complex that it's no longer binary. Most people think it's a choice between good and bad. And in reality, it's probably 50 shades of bad and 50 shades of good. Sometimes you've got to choose from. It becomes very complex pretty quickly.
So Ottangelo Grasso again says, there are universals which are objectively true in all circumstances, like it's wrong to torture babies for fun. But I presume it's not universally true to lie all the time. So how does he know? How does he know which laws or which rules are universally true and which are not? Like because he's obviously got access to God. Brilliant. Right. Is he supposed to lie to the murderer or not? Because he's saying he definitely every time he's saying it's wrong to murder babies, even though I thought of a thought experiment where actually it could be right or at least less wrong to torture a baby. Right. But here, like, how does he navigate epistemologically through like knowing what is universal and what is not, and what is contextualizable? You know, if that's a word. You know, so can I lie sometimes when I get when it gets a good consequence? Well, then it's a good consequence that is defining the morality of that lie. Because I can't know if it's reflecting God or not, because I'm just going through my life. Like, I have to use moral reasoning to do that. And this is why, like, theories like Ottangelo Grasso's are just so naive. They're so simplistic. It's because they have absolutely no bearing on how we do ordinary morality on a daily basis. Because he can never, ever, ever defer to moral reasoning. He can never give a reason that says it's good or bad. Like, invading Ukraine, is that good or bad? Well, I can only know because it reflects God. So I'll have to ask God.
What would God say? Yeah.
What would God say?
Yeah.
Well, so he has no way of being able to arbitrate in any given situation because he's deferring entirely to God, which means moral reasoning is utterly useless. And he goes through life like he should go through life like some kind of automaton that just says, I don't know,
Jonathan,
ask God.
You just inspired something now. I'm actually thinking now it's actually quite sinister because this sort of thinking, it will actually hinder you from maturing as a human. Yeah. You will always defer to somebody else. Like, I can't think for myself. We cannot be moral agents. You know, I'm sorry. We have to ask the big brother. We cannot be trusted.
Yeah. And so the next argument I use, why you follow the commands. So if you are only following the commands to get to heaven and hell, and this is a problem with being a moral agent in Christianity, for example, or any religion that believes in this binary heaven and hell scenario, is that it's always hanging over you psychologically. So if you're saying, right, I'm going to be, if you're on a daily basis, you're a Christian that goes through life with heaven and hell on each shoulder, and you're thinking, you pass someone who's sitting in the road, a homeless person. You say, "Oh, should I give them $5?" And then you got heaven and hell sitting on your shoulders. So you go, "Oh my God, I don't want to go to hell, and I want to go to heaven." So you give them $5. What's the reason you gave them $5? What you're is completely egocentric. Is that you are being kind in order to justify your own future in heaven and avoid your own future in hell, which means that your kindness is not intrinsically like valuable in it or morally good in
I
and of
think it's
itself.
called delayed gratification. It's a psychological, you delay an immediate thing to get something bigger later on.
No, it's not quite. So it's sort of, but not quite. So delayed gratification is still about yourself. So it's like it's the famous cookie experiment or marshmallow experiment where you do I eat this one cookie now? The guy goes away, says I'm going to be back later, comes back 15 minutes later. If the cookie's still there, I'll give you two, right? And there's loads of experiments that come off the side of this that shows that actually there's loads of other skills associated with delayed gratification and successes in life if you could delay your gratification. But this isn't about delayed gratification. This is saying what is underwriting why you are being generous to this homeless person, and what's underwriting it often, if you are a really strongly religious person, is not I'm doing good for the goodness of this person or because God, or it might be because God wants me to, but the end result, the goal of your goal orientated morality here is you getting to heaven or avoiding hell. So in other words, it's a very selfish thing. You're saying, I'm actually giving money to this homeless person because it benefits me, full stop. So this isn't about them, this is about me. And the problem is it's really difficult to psychologically get away from that. I wrote one of my first feature articles for Only Sky was on exactly this topic, which is you can't get away from that kind of reasoning if it's always there, and it's very difficult for a Christian, I think, to be genuinely moral on account of moral intrinsic morality.
What would you say to the argument then? The poor person wouldn't know any different. If there is a fake morality that's always going to lead to feeding the poor, maybe not epistemically or ontologically, correct, but at least the poor person would get a meal.
No problem. I mean, that's just moral consequentialism. So again, that's fine. But again, I'm arguing from a Christian point of view here. So, like, if you want to accept moral consequentialism, which is generally not accepted by Christians, then yeah, that's fine. Which is to say that the value of that, but there are loads of different types of consequentialism. So you can look at the pure units of pleasure given to society as a whole, but then you can also concentrate on the intentions of the person. So it might and there are different ways of calculating stuff, but yes, yeah. The next one is things not commanded are okay. So we'll probably end after I do all of these 16. So things not commanded are okay. So what about things, again, go back to Tangelo Grasso, objective morality is underwritten by God. Yeah. What about things that you don't know are commanded or not? Or you don't know about? How can you work out whether they're right or wrong? Cybersecurity issues that aren't really talked about in the Bible. Like, how do we navigate the morality of certain things like that using only very sort of absolutist, do you have to look at some of these generic rules in the Bible or guidances in the Bible and then try and interpret them and apply them into these really modern contexts? Or does it mean that things that just aren't commanded in the Bible are okay? So I can do anything that's just God hasn't made a command about, and so there's an interesting tension.
What about the things that were overridden or deemed okay by God, and we have, as a humanity, went like, oh no, that's not going to fly anymore?
So I don't know if that's one of the arguments in this section, but it's one I talk about, which is intertestamental moral relativism or intercovenantal moral relativism, which is the idea that, in the Old Testament, it was wrong to eat shellfish and to wear clothing made of linen and wool.
Fabrics, yeah.
And yet in the New Testament, that's all right. Don't worry about that. But then this is now. It's like, okay, well, what's the difference between then and now? Oh, context. Oh, right. So moral relativism.
I mean, the poor guy, Moses' mate, who got killed on a Saturday for picking up sticks. So they abolished that. It's like, oh, so what happened to that guy?
Well, I mean, yeah. So it'd be interesting. Tangelo Grasso. How do you explain moral relativism in the Bible? These are obviously objective rules, right? But they were wrong then, but not wrong then. for those people, but not for these people. Oh, that looks very contextual. That doesn't look very absolute to me. That doesn't look okay. So, yeah, absolutely. Next one is, but God would never command rape, apart from he did, right? And the divine command theorists argue that God would never command bad things like murder and rape. But this is falsified by the fact that he did command it in the Bible. So the whole divine command theory thing is somewhat made problematic by all the terrible instances in the Bible of moral horror that God sanctions. And then the next argument, argument 11, and I really like this argument. This is powerful. This is, but God would never command rape. So again, similar one. How can you know? So this is the idea that when you say to the Christian, you say, look, God commanded rape in this Bible passage, right? And they say, but God would never command rape. But the divine command theorist cannot devolve to moral reasoning to say that God would never command rape. They could only know it's bad if God commanded by saying it's bad. So they're in a real problem here. I love this argument. So I'll read out my bit. Again, the defense is common, but God would never command rape. Yet in order to say that God would never command rape, we would have to know that rape is already wrong, independent of God. We cannot say God would never command it because it has never not commanded it. God, that is. I use it for God here. Although see above. And to say that it wouldn't would involve moral reasoning, which is contrary to what the divine command theorists believe about God. We have the problem with causality because a Christian can't say we know he wouldn't command rape because we know it is bad because of X and Y reasons. Christian apologists get seriously hamstrung when they cannot appeal to moral reasoning.
That's genius, because it infers the second part of the equation. So God says so because it's good, and if it's good, then why need God?
Yeah.
Tell
Exactly.
you that. We know already. You don't need God to tell you that.
Yeah, exactly. So the whole God would never command rape is already assuming moral reasoning has primacy over divine command theory. God, argument number 12. God cannot know it is. I say it. He is itself all good. So God cannot even know that, and I'll change it to he to make it easier. But in the book, I use it as the pronoun for God because God has no gender. To know that he himself is all good, because to do so, he would need to judge it himself on an objective standard. So God can't even know that he's all good, right? This is quite a difficult concept to think about, but how would God be able to have the self-reflective knowledge to be able to claim that he was all good? All God could say was that he was godlike. Good being tautologous with God, meaning the same thing, means that God would work himself into a circle in trying to define himself. It is quite similar to God being unable to know that he is not a God in a vat, or that there isn't a chain of gods matrix style above him. So God could, if you don't have an independent benchmark for what goodness is, for what morality is, God couldn't say meaningfully that I am good. All God could say was, I am God. Yes. And there's no I'm good because he's got no way of being able to measure his own.
But Jonathan, we know from the Old Testament that he's doing a bit of moral reasoning himself. The regretting of the drowning of the people, and putting a promise that not to do that ever again, sort of thing. Wouldn't that sort of can't we just deduce that God was doing a bit of his own moral reasoning at that point?
I mean, it's interesting to see that the Bible is kind of littered with elements of moral reasoning going on here and there. I mean, most of the Bible, Dan Barker's book's excellent, Mere Morality, that shows that the Bible really isn't a guide on how to be good to each other, but a guide on how to have a relationship with God. And there's very little moral guidance in any other dimension other than you to God and God to you, which is this power dynamic. And it's a really good book, Dan Barker's, to really exemplify that. 13th one, moral development in children, immorality without God. Philosopher Walter Sinner Armstrong states anyone who helps and refrains from harming others just because God commanded her to do so might not be hard-hearted, but her motivations are far from ideal. It would be better for them to help and refrain from harming other people out of concern for those other people. And he actually talks about how when you, in the moral development of children, when you teach them why they are being good, so don't do that because of this, don't do that because of that, they become much more rounded moral agents than if you tell them from a don't do that as a kind of direct command. And I'm not giving you any moral reasoning for that. It's just a direct command. So it turns out that the moral development of children is much better given an understanding of moral reasoning.
I love this statement.
Everyone likes to argue in a circle. Of course he does. And then we go back to the issue of non-Christians who have no access to Christianity. How do they do morality? Were they never good? Or you know, if they didn't know what the commands were, like how could they be good? Or what does it mean for them to use their moral reasoning? Is that just completely defunct? Like how does that work? And then of course we go back to the situation we talked about before about, you know, God front loading souls and stuff, but it's a bit of a problem. And 15th one is based on Stephen Mateson's paper, Ordinary Morality Implies Atheism. So Stephen Mateson, who's a philosophy professor, brought out a paper that was really interesting. It had a couple of really good points, but one of the interesting ones is, given that Christians don't like consequentialism, you have this idea that all evil and suffering is necessary, right? So this is a problem of evil. There is no such thing as gratuitous suffering. But the problem is, if you truly are a Christian that believes in this kind of setup, then it means that if you see any evil, you must stop it. You must not stop it, because by stopping it, you'll be stopping the necessary greater good that comes about from that evil. And he presents this in a lot of detail with lots of syllogisms and whatnot. So, you know, I advise reading the paper. But the idea is that if you see a doctor just about to inject your child with a vaccine, you say, you know, oh, it's to stop him getting tetanus or typhoid or whatever. You're like, oh, okay, that's a bit of pain, but it brings about a greater good. All right. That's how we understand the consequentialist nature of that. You know, what we wouldn't do is run up and rugby tackle the doctor straight away by saying, no, you're going to stop, because by rugby tackling the doctor and taking them out, they aren't going to give that greater good that eventually comes. Now, you see an old granny getting beaten up across the road by a little sort of whippersnapper. Now, you can easily beat that whippersnapper away. It's not a problem. But you're thinking, oh, if I stop that granny from being beaten up, I know there is no such thing as gratuitous evil and suffering. Therefore, if I stop that kid, then I'm stopping gratuitous suffering happening. I'm stopping a greater good from coming about. So therefore, what Stephen Mateson says is that if you really do believe in the problem of evil kind of theism mechanisms, then you should have moral paralysis. You shouldn't ever try and stop any bad from happening, because you will be stopping the necessary greater good.
Especially when you add to the atonement in Christianity, like I think Mother Teresa was kind of exposed later on that she was not a friend of the poor, but she was a friend of poverty, where she wasn't actually mitigating all these people going through pain. And she kind of said, like, they actually had to feel the pain because they had to feel a little bit of what our Lord and Savior felt, you know. So it's almost like it's a rite of passage. You gotta feel the pain to deserve what's great things to come.
You bring up Artangelo Grasso's last point, because this is my last argument. And this is brilliant. This is brilliant. I love this because this is like typical theists that think they know what they're talking about. And they go, and then actually it makes your argument for you. Right. Earthquakes and tornadoes are there because of a greater good. Without those things, there would be no life on Earth. Right. First of all, it's saying that God cannot produce life without tornadoes and earthquakes. Dinesh D'Souza said this once, and I called him out personally by email, and I had him on email, and just he had no answer really. I was like, so what? Omnipotent God couldn't create a universe in which there was both life and not earthquakes. So plate tectonics are necessary. That's how we understand life. That's a naturalistic atheism understanding of life. Life is helped along by thermal vents caused by plate tectonics and stuff, by, abiogenesis in the oceans. Brilliant. Thanks, Tangelo. You're right there. But God can do perpetual miracles. God is omnipotent. So if God can't produce life without earthquakes, then God is crap. Okay, fair enough. Right. Okay. Second thing, Otangelo Grasso, and you can tell I'm a bit annoyed here because this is just repetitive, but thinking he knows what he's talking about doesn't. Earthquakes and tornadoes are there because of a greater good. So straight away, he's saying that here is pain and horribleness and suffering that is allowable because of a greater good. This is moral consequentialism. Otangelo Grasso has just advocated for moral consequentialism, which is my last argument. And I've written an essay on this before, and I've updated the essay and answered William Lane Craig's rebuttals of that in my book, Why I'm Atheist and Not an Atheist, which is God is a consequentialist. So when you look at every single moral action or event or anything that takes place, or any theodicy, these are done for a greater good, which is like you've got Ebola for a greater good. You've got cancer for a greater good. You've got 230,000 people dying in tsunami for a greater good. You've got genocide for a greater good. Free will, soul building.
This is the ultimate consequentialist. Yeah.
This theodicy, that theodicy, this greater good, that greater good. Jesus died a sacrifice for a greater good. That's consequentialism. Fair enough, but that's consequentialism. And so what the problem, I mean, I don't want to put words into Otangelo Grasso's mouth here, but what then theists go is like, this is a real problem. We don't like consequentialism. It's a moral value system that this debunks what Otangelo has been saying, is that in that you need God to underwrite morality. Actually, he's saying you don't need God to underwrite morality here. He's saying a greater good underwrites morality. So he's using moral reasoning there, and he's using moral consequentialism in order to argue that point. Now, he can't do that unless he accepts that moral consequentialism is a valid moral value system. But he has said it is only underwritten in God. So he can't have both. So Otangelo has lost this argument just on that statement alone. He has just debunked his own previous thread of stuff before that. But what some Christians do is they realize this is a serious problem. So William Lane Craig then talks about how and it doesn't excuse all the kind of consequentialist things that goes on, but he tries to say that God, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, which is God isn't a moral agent. He says that God has no obligations, God blah blah blah. But again, you can't say God is love and then God is not a moral agent. You can't say, God does all these good things and then say he's not a moral agent, he has no duties or obligations to himself. And anyway, the philosophy that Craig uses to do that is problematic, but that's a whole other hour and a half in and of itself.
And on the back of this, the fine-tuning argument is also debunked, because if you talk about the very fine parameters for life to exist, it's almost like God is following a recipe to make a cake, and only through that recipe, going through it exactly, you won't have a cake. So therefore, anybody who follows that recipe can end up with a cake. But if God is truly God, he doesn't need to have a recipe for it to make a cake. He can do this and makes a cake. So, and Otangelo Grasso realizes he's in a bit of a problem here. So he says God cannot do anything. He can do what is possible. So again, he's now, but essentially what does he mean? He's not defining what is possible here. Is he meaning what is naturalistically possible by the laws of physics? In which case, God is the one that created the laws of physics, right? So, if he's saying that he couldn't have started life without plate tectonics, then he is saying he's devaluing God's omnipotence there by a massive, massive degree. He said we cannot create a car without one atom. So Jonathan's objection is silly. God's omnipotence must be defined. I mean, it's just a bunch of assertions there, but it really doesn't work. Saying, yes, God needs a recipe. My reasoning is wrong. No, my reasoning is right. If God needs a recipe to make life happen, that means he is not omnipotent.
He's being defined by constraints that sit outside of his own existence.
Exactly.
So I mean, gee whiz, Otangelo. I mean, that is just. If you want to believe that, fair enough. It just means that God is way less than you think God is, and there are some third-party things that are more powerful than God that define how God does things. he might be trying to have a little go. I mean, Craig does this, but he talks about what feasibility. So he talks about it as unfeasible, and we'll talk about that later in a heaven and hell argument where Craig lost an argument to Ray Bradley, but Bradley didn't take him far enough to do with feasibility and what God could.
Maybe Otangelo subscribes to the maximally, powerful, not omnipotent. Fair enough.
Yeah,
that's all right.
But again, but if he can't, literally, Otangelo is saying he cannot create life without plate tectonics. And if you live, but he can create heaven, where we've got all the aspects of life living as souls, apart from just not the material kind of reproductive aspects of life, but we can exist as souls in heaven. He can do that, but he can't produce material life on earth without plate tectonics. It's like, oh my goodness, mate.
But he says God can only navigate through the possible, but aren't miracles is the suspension of natural laws and therefore the impossible? So I mean,
so his whole argument falls apart just by saying miracles, because God can do perpetual miracles. Either God can do miracles or he can't. If God can do miracles, then he can create life without viruses and without plate tectonics.
Like holding the sun in the middle of the day so Joshua can win a war. So that's such a miraculous thing to do. But looks like you forgot to know that the day and night is actually caused by holding the Earth from rotating around its own axis rather than the Earth.
Good point, well made. But of course, what this shows is that half-baked ideas don't really work. I mean, does he then drop any miracle claim of the Bible, like the one you just mentioned? Does he drop that because God can't do those things, because otherwise God could create life without viruses, could create life without plate tectonics? Just a complete mess of thinking there, I have to say.
Lots of holes. What do you think, Jonathan? I mean, we've got like an hour, 55 minutes. Do you want to sort of end up with one last point?
So basically, divine command theory. I mean, we haven't gone through all the other problem of evil arguments and natural evil and all those juicy arguments, but divine command theory, which I assume someone like Otangelo Grasso believes some version of, just doesn't work. It doesn't work for 16 reasons I gave you there. And it is thoroughly broken, and I think any idea that God underwrites morality is thoroughly problematic.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I really today's episode was really heated. And look, Otangelo's thank you for at least challenging our point of view, because otherwise it would have been an echo chamber. So it's actually good to find somebody who's coming to challenge some points. So it's actually a good thing, I think.
I was getting at earlier is make sure it's on topic. So that we were talking about morality, that's fine, right? Yeah. So that's why I entertain that. But to derail it to talk about something utterly different, that's fine if you're going to super chat and put your hard-earned money into Hanney's project. Please do that, and if you super chat that, we can talk about that. But if you're just going to throw in comments that are not worthy, well, they are worthy, but not worthy in this discussion, then that is just derailing it, and it's not on.
Fair enough, and you demand it from everyone. Like if you enter a conversation, you'd want to be on topic and not just turn up and derail the conversation into something else, which is
a simple politeness. Yeah, I think that's a great point. Like, would you do that? Would you sit down and change? No. People are talking about things. They've imagine you've got two people on stage for a stage thing that they're presenting, and then you got on stage with them and said, "I demand you change the conversation topic to this." You'd be like, "Hang on, that's not what we're here for."
It's a bit rude.
Yeah, a bit rude.
Well, thank you so much. I understand that from next week, myself and you will be sort of away, absent for a few weeks. Are you planning to do anything while you're away? Are you going to be tempted to broadcast anything while you're away?
My partner did say last night, I bet you're going to try and do a video in the hotel. I'm like, no, I can't. I don't want to. This is going to be family, and I'm going to relax. But I might sort some out and like schedule them and do the old pressing of buttons. But yeah.
Yeah, I'll do a bit of filing and stuff like that while I'm sort of. But yeah, folks, from next week onward, I think next week I've got one last conversation with Dr. Robert Price. We're going to do Paul the Apostle, and I'm going to be breaking for about 4 or 5 weeks going to Europe. and Jonathan as well. So Jonathan's all details are in the description of the video as usual. Please follow him. Please subscribe to his channel. He started to do his own material as well on his channel, and he's linked to his Amazon. Plenty of books there. How many books so far? About 9 or 10?
Oh, I don't know. Probably
Lost
half
count.
dozen, half dozen.
Yeah.
I've written fiction books as well. So
Oh, that's brilliant. Well, thank you so much, folks. We wish you a good rest of the weekend. Thanks very much.